Well, thank you guys for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. As he said, my name is Maharrey, and I came from the lovely state of Kentucky. And this is a completely different world out here. And it's been neat. Driving out here was amazing. I mean, the landscape is incredible. And I've enjoyed getting to know some of you folks and just appreciate the opportunity to be out here and talk to you guys tonight. I also feel very overdressed, and which is kind of funny because I never wear a suit. Only when I speak. It's just kind of what I do. So, but anyway, thought I'd share that with you. So I'm the National Communications Director for an organization called the 10th Amendment Center, and I can sum up the core philosophy of our organization in one sentence. It's follow the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. That's the foundation of everything that we do at the 10th Amendment Center. Now, sometimes people will ask, they'll say, well, yeah, but what are you? You know, because you have to be something. You know, are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Are you a conservative? Are you a liberal? What are you? And really answer the question, we're really not anything. We really hold to this constitutional concept that every issue that we approach is looked at through the lens of what the founders intended in the Constitution. And that gets us in trouble with pretty much everybody at some point. I mean, we make the conservatives mad sometimes, we make the Democrats mad a lot of the time. We even make libertarians mad sometimes because we have this principle that we hold to the Constitution. Now, a lot of times I'll say this, and I'll use that sentence, and people will say, well, Mike, you know what, you're too dogmatic. You're just too dogmatic about the Constitution. I think dogmatic is supposed to be some kind of insult. I think that's supposed to hurt my feelings that you're calling me dogmatic. But it's true, I am dogmatic about the Constitution. You know what else I'm dogmatic about? My fixed rate mortgage. I am. My wife and I have a mortgage, and when we signed that mortgage, we agreed to a certain interest rate, and we agreed that we would make our payment on a certain date. And after 30 years, we no longer have the mortgage, it'll be paid off. Now, imagine if one day the bank called up and said, Mike, we've been looking at this mortgage and we think we can interpret it in a different way. And we're going to raise your interest rate 2%. And instead of paying once a month, we want you to pay us twice a month. And oh, by the way, you can pay us for 40 years now instead of 30. Now, am I going to accept that? Well, of course not. I'm going to throw a fit. And I'm certainly not going to let some dude that the bank appoints to make the final decision for me. No, I'm dogmatic about my mortgage because I agreed to certain terms, and it's fixed in time. And it's the same thing with the Constitution. The Constitution created a central government. It delegated that government certain powers, and I think we should be very dogmatic about it in the same way we would be dogmatic about any contract and about our mortgage. So the people that say that I'm being dogmatic and think that's supposed to make me feel silly, really they're the ones that feel silly because it's silly. Interestingly, this is exactly what James Madison said, how we should look at the Constitution, according to the man that's often called the father of the Constitution. He said, I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. And if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable more than for a faithful exercise of its powers. If the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of words, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. What a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all of its ancient phraseology were taken in a modern sense. So Madison was saying we can't look at the Constitution in the terms of how we want to look at it today. It had a specific meaning at the time it was ratified, and that is the meaning that we need to hold to up until the time it's changed by an amendment. Now, I'm not really into all this just because I love the Constitution, although I do. There's a deeper philosophical undertone in what I do and what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. It's not just about the Constitution for the Constitution's sake. It's because the Constitution created a system that separated powers and dispersed powers in a decentralized way. The way the Constitution is set up is most governance is supposed to be at the state and local level. And I think most of us would agree that it's better, if you're going to have people governing you, that they be close by and they know what the heck's going on in your community, right? It's like any monopoly. And I use this analogy a lot. I'll tell people, and especially people on the left, because people on the left hate economic monopolies and they hate Walmart. And I'll say, look, what if one day I said, you know what, somebody gave me all the power in the world, and I've decided that Walmart is really good at selling groceries, so from now on, Walmart is going to be the only place in the country that you can buy groceries. Because, they're going to do a great job, and of course, they would throw a fit. They'd be like, no, that's horrible. They're going to raise the prices, and we'll get crappy service. And they'll have all these horrible reasons that they don't want Walmart to have a monopoly. Well, then why in the world do you want a monopoly government in Washington, D.C.? It doesn't make any sense. We understand intuitively that governance is better close to home. I was talking to a lady over here just a little while ago, and I was saying, I don't really understand the dynamics of ranching and the BLM and all that stuff. I live in Kentucky. We don't have that. And yet there are people in Washington, D.C. that are making policy that you guys have to live under that don't know any more about it than I do. And that's absurd. So that's why we do what we do, because the federal government is not supposed to be doing all this stuff. It's supposed to be a dispersed, decentralized system. And that's really what I believe in. I believe in decentralization. I believe that power is dangerous and it should be dispersed as widely as possible. But when you get down to it, it all comes down to power, right? And in the way that the Constitution was set up, ultimately, we're supposed to be on the top of the power pyramid, we the people. It says so right on the top of the Constitution. It says, we the people. It's not supposed to be the Supreme Court. Hello. There you go. It's not the Supreme Court. It's not the Bureau of Land Management. It's not Congress. They're not in charge. They're not the top of the power pyramid. But we've gone so long in this country allowing the federal government to exercise all of these unconstitutional powers that it's essentially flipped the system on its head. And that's not a good thing. So it's about power. It's about who exercises it. So once upon a time there was a rancher. And he was out and working and mending some fences and doing his thing. And all of a sudden he sees this cloud of dust coming down the road. And he's looking, kind of looks out and waits a few minutes, and all of a sudden a black SUV comes pulling up, and he hits the brakes, and this guy jumps out, and he's wearing a suit that's a lot better tailored and fancier than mine. He's got the slick shoes and the sunglasses, the little earpiece. He goes, son, I'm from the federal government, I'm a federal agent, and I need to inspect your lands. The rancher leans up against his pickup truck and goes, well, I reckon you got to do what you got to do. But I just want to tell you, you don't want to go in that field right there. And of course, the federal agent gets all indignant. He puffs up his chest and he pulls out his badge. And he goes, you see this? You know what this is? And she goes, well, it looks to me like a badge. He goes, that's right, it's a badge. And with this badge, I can go where I want, when I want, and how I want. You don't have anything to say about it. Right? Just do what you need to do. So, of course, the federal agent, the first place he wants to go is in the field where he was told he probably shouldn't go. So he goes tromping out in the field, and he walks way out in the distance. About 5 minutes later, you hear this shriek. And all of a sudden, you see this guy in a suit running, hightailing it for the fence as fast as he can. And right on his tail is a giant bull. And the guy's yelling, help, help! And the rancher leans up over the fence and he goes, show him your badge! I like that joke. But it gives us an actual reality. There's actually an illustration in there because the federal government's power is as illusionary as the power of that badge when it's faced with other power sources. And that's our key. And that's the way the system was designed. The federal government was meant to be checked. It was meant to be a system that restrained federal power and kept it in place. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about a concept that is called nullification. And a lot of people get really antsy and nervous when they hear that word. And we'll talk a little bit more about why. But the truth of the matter is, nullification, even back in the 1800s, was considered by many of its advocates to be the moderate middle road. And they use that word a lot, the moderate middle road between absolute submission and outright revolution. We don't want a revolution. But we don't want to submit absolutely to authority that shouldn't exist in the first place. We need to utilize this middle road. I've been reading Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, and I agree philosophically with about 100% of what the man stood for, but he was brilliant when it came to organizing and understanding how to harness power and use it in a political way. And he made an interesting statement in his book near the very beginning, and he said that to say that power comes from the barrel of a gun is absurd when the other guy's got all the guns. Now granted, we've got our share of guns, but we're not going to win in a face-to-face physical battle with the federal government. I don't think any of us want that. I think there's consequences from that we don't want to endure. But that doesn't mean we just have to lay down and quit. We have tools at our disposal, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, when I mention nullification, and I mention state sovereignty, and I start talking about this thing, I'm immediately branded as an extremist. It's another one of those things that's supposed to offend me. I'm an extremist and I'm dogmatic. I guess I'm a dogmatic extremist. And honestly, it used to bother me a little bit, the whole extremist thing, because nobody really wants to be considered an extremist. I don't really feel like an extremist. But then I started thinking about it. And I thought about what that word means, and I thought about what the mainstream people gave us, okay? The people that are the mainstream, they're the ones that created the BLM. The mainstream people gave us the $640 toilet seat. It's the basic mainstream middle-of-the-road guys that grope me when I fly out of the airport. So if this is the mainstream, maybe being an extremist isn't so bad, right? Because mainstream seems pretty stupid. They've given us $16 trillion in debt. So I wear the badge of extremist pretty proudly at this point because I'm a little bit tired of what the mainstream has given us. And honestly, if I'm an extremist, I'm in really good company because the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are the very things that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and even Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton loved centralized power, but even he would be appalled at what the federal government has developed into today. So before we can really talk about what to do, we need to have a basic understanding of the constitutional structure that was created. And I'm going to hit this pretty fast. If you saw Chrisanne's presentations, she really dug into this deeply, so some of it will be kind of a review. But I think it's important that we understand this foundation solidly so that we can understand how to confront these people when they try to tell us that we're wrong, because we're not. Most of you probably know that the Constitution was drafted in what was known as the Philadelphia Convention, or commonly called the Constitutional Convention. And the interesting thing is the first proposals that were brought up in the Philadelphia Convention all were designed to create a very strong national government. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but James Madison actually wanted the federal government to have veto power over any state law. So, obviously Oregon didn't exist at this point, but say Oregon passed a law and the federal government didn't like it. Madison wanted the federal government to be able to veto that law. All of these big government national ideas were ultimately voted down through the progress of the convention. They scrapped all of those, and what we were left with was a limited federal government that had enumerated powers, and by enumerated I mean that they were spelled out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And all of the rest of the powers were left to the states and the people. That's the Constitution that came out of the Philadelphia Convention. Now, one of the ways that we can understand what the Constitution was intended is by reading the Federalist Papers. And some of you may have read them. A lot of them are boring. But there's some beautiful jewels in the Federalist Papers. And the important thing to understand about the Federalist Papers is that they were designed to sell the Constitution to the people. Because the truth of the matter was, there were a lot of people in the United States that were very wary of ratifying the Constitution. They were afraid that the Constitution was going to give the federal government too much power. And the battle during the ratification wasn't between people who wanted the federal government to be big and those that wanted the federal government to be little. They all agreed on that. The argument was, would this Constitution give us the limited government that it promised? So the Federalists, those in support of the Constitution, were desperately trying to sell to the people that this was going to create a limited government. And that's what the Federalist Papers do. Federalist 45, James Madison lays out the basic structure of the federal government. And it's one of my favorite passages of the Federalist because it very simply tells us what they thought they were creating. And what it said was that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So the federal government was supposed to exercise few defined powers. The state governments were supposed to exercise numerous and indefinite powers. Madison went on and he explained that the powers that the federal government would primarily deal with were things like war and peace, foreign trade, treaties with other countries, things that you do want that union to represent all of the states. But he said all of the things that involve the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal improvements of the state, all of those things were to remain with the state governments. So when you start talking about land use, when you start talking about health care, when you start talking about workplace regulations, all of those things are meant to be handled at the state level. And it's just like I was saying earlier, it's because you guys know how to manage your land here in Oregon a heck of a lot better than some bozo wearing a tie in D.C. does, or some bozo standing in front of you talking about it. I can't begin to tell you what good land policy would be in this state. I admit that, and I'm not going to try to. That's when I'm smarter than a Fed. So, the key to really understanding the Constitution, the Federalist Papers are important, and we see in that the federal government was meant to be limited. The really important place that we need to look to figure out what the Constitution was supposed to mean, and I wish the Supreme Court understood this, where we're really supposed to look is at the ratifying conventions. What happened is each state elected representatives to a special convention to decide whether or not they were going to ratify and accept the Constitution. All 13 of the states at the time did that. At that point, they were free and independent states. When they ratified, they agreed to form a union. So when you look at these ratification debates, and believe it or not, I'm such a nerd that I've read a lot of them, you begin to really understand what the debates were, and you begin to really understand what those that supported the Constitution were saying that it meant. And it's very interesting. Virginia was one of the most important states politically at the time, partly because it was halfway between the Deep South and the northern states, so it was a little bit of a political mix. There were a lot of very prominent founding fathers that were from Virginia, Washington and Madison and George Mason and Patrick Henry and all those folks. And, interestingly, it was almost 50-50 split between supporters of the Constitution and those that felt like, there's some things in here that they're going to be able to drive a horse and buggy through, to get extra power. Patrick Henry being chief among those. And at the time, early in the ratification process, it was beginning to look like Virginia would not ratify. That would have been very significant if Virginia had decided not to ratify the Constitution. But there was a guy named George Nicholas, and he was a friend of Madison's. And he was the person that gave a speech during that convention that kind of turned the tide toward ratification. And what he did was he explained it as a contract, kind of like I was doing, with my little analogy with the mortgage. And what he said is he said that if 13 individuals were to enter into a contract together, and they all agreed that the terms were what they said that they meant, and then one day that somebody came along and said, we're going to change the terms of this, he said we would be exonerated from it. In other words, he told the Virginia Ratifying Convention that if the federal government or if somebody else came along and said, well, we're going to start taking on extra powers, we're going to start doing things in power-wise that we said weren't going to happen, that they would be exonerated from it. In other words, they don't have to follow it. And that's what's turned the tide for ratification. So here it is in a nutshell. The Constitution was created by the people of the states. They had already created their state governments. They were free and independent states. They agreed to a union. They agreed to create a federal government. They gave it specific delegated powers. There's only about 20 of them. And all of the rest was supposed to be left to the state and local governments. That's the system that we were given. Now, is that the system that we have today?
I don't think so.
No. Nowhere near. I mean, the federal government, to say the federal government has powers that are few and defined, that would be absurd. I mean, when you've got a federal government that can come in and tell you that, you have to clear off the land because of a turtle. That's not viewed and defined. But the real question comes down. Now we're going to start getting into a little bit more practical, but still right now a little bit into the philosophy. The question always comes down. You talk about this and you can say, okay, Mike, I get it. Constitution. But who decides what the Constitution means? Now, if you ask that question, 99 out of 100 Americans are going to say, oh, the Supreme Court does. And I say that to say the Supreme Court has the final say on what is constitutional is an absolute absurdity. And I'm going to explain why. But it wasn't just me that said it was an absolute absurdity. Thomas Jefferson said it was an absolute absurdity, and he's a lot better authority than I am. He said that the government created by this compact, by compact he just meant the Constitution, was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. But that as in all other cases of a compact among powers having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well as infractions, as of the mode and measure of redress. Putting that in plain and simple English, it's ridiculous to think that the federal government gets to decide the powers of the federal government. What I just explained to you is unarguably the system that we were given. Now, do you really think that these brilliant founding fathers would have said, you know, we're going to create this federal government and we're going to make it limited, and then we're going to let the federal government decide what the extent of its powers? Well, it's not limited anymore. It doesn't make sense. It's like the referee in a basketball game, okay? You guys like basketball, football, or not care about any of it here?
Football.
Football? Okay, what would be a big rivalry? Like Oregon State? Let's say Oregon. Let's say you got the Oregon State game. Now, all of you Oregon fans, would you agree to have an Oregon State player be the referee for the game?
Absolutely.
I see where you're...
Oregon's on that side of the room.
I see where your loyalty lies. You get the point. I mean, nobody's going to say, well, yeah, we'll let one of the teams be the referee in the game. That doesn't make any sense. But that's exactly what people are saying when they insist that the Supreme Court gets to be the final judge in a dispute. Because the Supreme Court is part of the federal government. And I wrote it like this. I have to read this because I wrote it. The absurdity of all this is expecting the Supreme Court, which is part of the federal government, with justices appointed by the President, part of the federal government, and approved by the Senate, part of the federal government, to overrule Congress, part of the federal government, and actually limit the power of the federal government. That's what people are asking you to believe. And when they throw this at you, and they're going to, this just drives me crazy, because I deal a lot with the media, and when we're doing activism and bills and stuff, I have to deal with the media. And they always trot out some Looney Tune from some school somewhere that's a political science professor, and he's supposed to be smart because he's got professor in front of his name. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. He always says, well, the federal government is supreme, because it says so in the Constitution, in the Supremacy Clause. And they haven't read the Supremacy Clause, because the Supremacy Clause said these laws that are made in pursuance of the Constitution, not anything that the federal government wants to do. These people drive me absolutely crazy. So I've taken to using this type of illustration because it makes them look silly, because it is silly. Nevertheless, we still have a practical problem, because the system as it exists today is pretty much run on the basis that the Supreme Court gets to decide everything. And so we've got these laws, and when you start trying to push back using state law or even local law, you're always going to get that legal pushback. Well, you can't do that because the federal government is supreme, and you can't dispute it. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that, because in their infinite wisdom, in 1842, the federal government, Supreme Court, a guy named Joseph Story, who was a national Supreme Court justice, gave us a legal doctrine that creates a tool that we can use to push back against the federal government. And when the legal scholars and the political scientists come to us and say, well, you know, Supremacy Clause, I can say it doesn't matter because this is Supreme Court approved. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. It's important to understand the philosophy, because people are going to throw it at you. But we have a tool that overrides their philosophy. And actually, the really cool thing is, it was James Madison who gave us this tool. And we go back to the Federalist Papers. Remember, I talked about that there was a lot of questions people had. that how is this government going to remain limited? Patrick Henry vehemently opposed the Constitution because he was afraid that they would take things like the General Welfare Clause and the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause and expand them to allow the federal government to do whatever it wants. And Patrick Henry was pretty much right. When this question was brought up, Madison said, there's a remedy. And what he believed was that the states would serve as a check on the federal government. So we all understand that the federal government was designed to have 3 branches of government that were supposed to be checks and balances, the legislative, judicial, and executive. Well, there's a 4th check, and that's the states. This is what Madison said. Madison said in Federalist 46 that we have a means of opposition that is powerful and at hand. Those are the exact words he used. And then he lists off some things that states could do to block federal power. Now, the interesting thing is he said, when the federal government passes a unwarrantable action, so unwarrantable means something that is illegal, it'd be unconstitutional. And then he said, or even a warrantable act that happens to be extremely unpopular, we have a means of opposition that is powerful and at hand. So not only for constitutional things, but for things that are just dumb that they happen to do in D.C. that might be constitutional, the states can still utilize these tools. The first tool he talked about was protesting, and that the governors could protest, and that the people would protest, and nobody wants bad press. But the most important thing that he mentioned, and this is the exact word he used, he said, refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Those are the words that Madison used, that states can refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. He said if one state did this, it would create severe impediments. But he said if a bunch of states got together and did it, that it would create obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. And it's interesting because at the time, the states really didn't do a whole lot for the federal government. Today, virtually everything that the federal government does requires state and local assistance. From law enforcement to land management, the states and the local governments are involved in those things in many, many different ways. And as a result, when the states refuse to cooperate, and we're not talking about trying to stop federal agents, we're basically just saying, okay, feds, do it yourself. So let me just give you an example of how it might work. Let's say that President Obama passes some kind of executive order. Let's get really extreme, and let's say he decides that he's going to confiscate all assault rifles. And of course, the first thing is to figure out what the heck an assault rifle is, right? But let's say he passes this law. So what can the states do? Well, the state could basically pass a law and say, our state and local law enforcement and our sheriffs are not allowed to assist the federal government in enforcing this federal gun law. I guarantee you, if 20 or 30 states did that, that law would be impossible to enforce. The federal government doesn't have enough agents to go around and round up every assault rifle in the United States. It is going to depend on your state police and your local cops. Just look at the situation here that happened over the last few weeks. I guarantee you that the state and local law enforcement were involved. I saw state police on the TV. So you have a tool at the legislative level, and I know that the questions are spinning in your head, and we're going to get to some of those. But this is a tool that we have. Refusal to cooperate with officers union. Now the beauty of it is, like I said, this is Supreme Court approved. There's 4 Supreme Court cases that date all the way back to 1842, and they establish what is known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. In a nutshell, the anti-commandeering doctrine holds that the federal government cannot force or compel the state to provide any assets or personnel to enforce a federal act or implement a federal program. It can try to do it itself. They're not going to let the state try to block the federal government from doing it, but they can't force the feds to. And the beauty of it is that in Sebelius, which was the Obamacare decision, which was 99% awful, there was one jewel in that, because they held that the federal government could not pull Medicaid funding from a state that refused to expand Medicaid. In other words, they couldn't say, well, we're going to make the state expand Medicaid because if they don't, we're going to take their funding. You can't do it. The Supreme Court says so. So we have a tool here that Madison gave us that he says would work. And we have a tool here that is court approved. So when the smart aleck political science professor says, well, we have the supremacy clause, and they're going to do it because they're still doing it, you can look at them and say, Prague versus Pennsylvania, 1842. And they're not going to know what you're talking about, and then they're going to feel stupid because they're going to realize that the anti-commandeering doctrine is well established. There's no argument, there's no debate about this. 4 or 5 years ago, we used to talk about nullification in different terms. We used to talk about it, we used to try to explain the relationship between the state and the federal government, and that's all legitimate. And I have a book. I forgot, I have to sell my book. This is my shameless promotion. I have written a book, it's called Our Last Hope, and it actually outlines the philosophical, historical, and moral case for nullification. And it builds on what I've talked about tonight in depth. It goes into all the founding fathers, there's a bajillion quotes, and it builds the case for the sovereignty of the states except for the powers delegated. And I would be more than happy to sell you one of my lovely books after we're done. But the most important thing to understand is that we can refuse to cooperate, and that stuff doesn't even matter. And the legal scholars and all of them, if they know what they're talking about, they have to be compelled to agree. So the next question that always comes up is can this really work? Can it really work? It sounds great. It's a great theory, right? But who cares about a great theory if it's not going to work? Well, I say it can work and it has worked. And I'm going to give you 2 examples, one of them historical, one of them modern. The historical example that I'm going to use is probably going to surprise a lot of people because we're not taught this in our history classes. Surprise, surprise. Usually when you start talking about nullification, you say the word states' rights. And I don't really like the word states' rights because technically a state doesn't have a right, people have rights. So when you say states' rights, you really mean the people of the states and that political society that they've developed. But that's a technicality. When you start talking about states' rights, you're always going to get somebody that's going to look at you and go, you're racist. I've been called a racist a lot, which is really, really ironic if you ever meet my wife. I would make a very, very bad racist. But the truth of the matter is, and people think this, what's her name, Rachel Maddow. She went on TV a few years ago and did this whole thing about how nullification was all about slavery and racism, and she had pictures of John Calhoun with this crazy hair. And it's not true. Nullification was never once used in support of slavery. Southern states never used it. In fact, it was northern states, it was abolitionists who utilized state sovereignty and the principles of nullification to protect runaway slaves and protect free blacks that were in their state legally. And what they did was they passed what were known as personal liberty laws that basically pushed back against the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In my humble opinion, Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was one of the worst laws that was ever passed by Congress, and that's saying a lot, considering all the garbage that's come out of Washington, D.C. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 would basically let me, as a white guy, go up into any northern state, find any black person, say, I own that person, and it would be my word against basically nobody's. The black person that was accused of being a fugitive slave was not even allowed under the law to make a defense. They weren't allowed to make a statement. They weren't allowed to provide proof. So if I'm a free black, and there were a lot of free blacks in the North, I could go up there, and they did this. I could go up there and say, well, I own this person, and then they just take them back south and sell them. Not only that, there was no due process. Not only that, it would also force unwilling residents in a town in the north to round up fugitive slaves. It was illegal to help a fugitive slave. If you helped somebody that you might suspect was a runaway, even giving them a piece of bread or water, you were subject to being arrested and charged with a federal crime. It was a $2,000 fine and up to, I think, 6 months in prison. $2,000, I looked it up, that was like $28,000 in today's terms. So that's a lot of money. It was a horrible law. It was a draconian law. And northern states said, look, we don't agree with this. We believe people should have due process. Even those that agreed that, we might need to send slaves that were legitimately slaves that had run away back. Even they agreed that there should at least be due process for these people. So northern states started passing personal liberty laws. And what they did was they basically refused to cooperate with officers of the Union. For instance, in Michigan, they made it illegal to use state or local jails to hold accused runaways. So the federal marshal could go up there and round up somebody, and, but they didn't have a place to take them. They wouldn't let them use the jails. Michigan also mandated that anybody that was accused of being a runaway slave would get a jury trial. Sounds fair, right? Contrary to the federal government. The federal government said you can't do that. They did it anyway. In Massachusetts, any state officer, so like a state judge or a state attorney, anybody that had an official office with the state, if they cooperated with fugitive slave rendition, they would forever be barred from ever holding state office again. They were subject to impeachment, never allowed to operate in the state again. Vermont went the farthest. Vermont basically just said, if you come up here and try to take a black person away, we're going to charge you with kidnapping. So they actually went all the way to the point of arresting federal agents. Now, I don't think arresting federal agents is generally a good idea. It creates a legal issue that it's just going to be difficult to pull off practically, although I think it is a valid legal option. But that's where Vermont went. These laws were extremely effective. In fact, after we passed the personal liberty law in Massachusetts, we can't find any records of any fugitive slave being taken back south. It was so effective, in fact, if you look at the South Carolina Declaration of Causes, which was the document that they produced when they seceded from the Union, if you look at that, the very first thing that they list as a complaint was that northern states were nullifying, and they used the word nullifying, the fugitive slave laws. So it worked. It was effective, and it was powerful. I like it because it shows that state action can thwart federal action when enough states cooperate together and people are willing to back it up. It was extremely effective, and I think it was a righteous cause. So when people tell you that, oh, you like states' rights, you must be some kind of racist, you can tell them that story and they'll go, oh. Because it had nothing to do with racism. It's the opposite. So how about today? Well, I can tell you two situations right here in Oregon where the state has effectively nullified federal law. Marijuana and hemp. The federal government maintains absolute prohibition on marijuana. And as I understand it, I could probably go find marijuana somewhere in the state. I don't really care to. It's not my thing. But from a constitutional standpoint, there is absolutely no authority for the federal government to prohibit a plant. And if you doubt me on this, just ask yourself this question. Why did it take a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol? What's the difference? There is no difference. It's just that the times changed and we had the living, breathing Constitution, and so they decided that they were going to maintain this type of prohibition. It's a state issue. And Oregon's decided that they're going to legalize marijuana, and I haven't seen the DEA come in here and start raiding people. Now, when they first started doing this in California, they cracked down hard. And you know what? It just kept growing. Of course, it was California. What do you expect? But then the Supreme Court ruled. And the Supreme Court, yeah, we can regulate up 6 plants growing in somebody's backyard. But did all the other states say, oh, okay, well, then we're not going to do it? No. Today, there are 23 states that have legalized medical marijuana. And then there's 4 states that have legalized marijuana completely. That genie will never be put back in the bottle. There is no way that the federal government will ever again be able to really enforce prohibition of marijuana. Here's a fun fact. We did some research and we got some numbers and we found out how much money it cost for the DEA to investigate and raid one marijuana dispensary. And this was like, we were looking at it for medical. This was before they legalized it in Colorado. And what we determined, we did the math, it would cost almost the entire DEA budget for a year just to shut down the medical marijuana clinics in Denver. One city in one state. They don't have the resources. That's why this works. The federal government is like the guy running around with the badge. They got us all cowed into thinking they've got all this power and authority, and they can. Don't get me wrong. I know they can cause damage. But when enough states come together, when enough people agree, then this can be a very effective methodology. The second thing is hemp, which is, the cousin of marijuana. And I think hemp's an even better issue. I think hemp could be a bridge issue for you folks here in Oregon when dealing with people in the western part of the state who are a little bit more nervous about talking about defying the federal government. Because, those people over there, they like their hemp granola. And the Democrats love legalized hemp. Well, when they say, well, we can't defy the federal government. Yeah, you can, you're doing it. They have already lost the high ground on that. So this is a tool that you guys can use. And I think, I think a lot of people, hemp to me is an incredible economic crop potentially. I've got a friend in Kentucky that's in the biofuel industry. And he says that the energy potential for a biofuel in hemp is way beyond ethanol or corn or anything. It's a green crop. The lefties love it. And yet the federal government, for whatever crazy reason, they still, we're gonna prohibit this. Well, you know what? Prohibit it all you want. We're gonna do it anyway. And what happens is, yes, people could still be, you could plant your 5 acres of hemp here in Oregon, and the feds could come in. I almost guarantee you that they won't. And the fact that the state has lifted that burden off has made people willing to do it. There's a vibrant hemp market developing in Colorado right now. It's starting in Vermont, South Carolina, a number of other states. So we see that this tool works because of the position the federal government is in. So we have precedent on our side. Now let's talk practical a little bit, because we need to figure out how can you guys deal with the issues that you have. And I understand that one of the biggest issues, and this is not something that just happened over the last few weeks, although a lot of people in America probably think it is, but the issue of land management. Okay? The federal government has very little actual constitutional authority to manage lands. Constitutionally, the federal government can manage Washington, D.C. It can manage territories, which that's Puerto Rico and Guam. I don't think that has anything to do with us. And they can manage other property. So basically things that are necessary and proper to other things. So like they can have land for a post office, or land for a harbor, or land for a military base. There are things that the federal government can do. But all of the rest of this land they were supposed to dispose of, like whenever Oregon became a state. It was really supposed to be sold off privately. So all of this land that they're managing out there, they're really supposed to be allowing private ownership and if not that, the state to control that land. So the key is, and this is your homework. I'm going to give you homework, and then I'm going to go back to Kentucky. But this is your homework. Your homework is to figure out, and I guarantee you it happens, how does the state and local agencies cooperate with the Bureau of Land Management? And how can you get them to stop offering that assistance? Now, I know that seems like a high hurdle, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take steps. And it's going to be harder in Oregon than some states because of the political dynamics. But you guys are not alone. There is a large organization beginning to coalesce after what's happened, and people are becoming aware. Coalition of Western States is a group that I've kind of gotten involved in just recently. Chris Ann's involved in it. There's a number of state legislators that are already involved in it. There are people that this is affecting, not just in Oregon, but in Utah, in Arizona, in Alaska, in Washington State. These folks can come together. And while you may not be able to get anything done immediately here, I guarantee you that the political climate in Arizona is much more friendly towards basically telling the feds to go jump on a deep lake. So it's going to take time and organization and working together. But you've got to figure out how to do it. And it's one of the things that I aim to do is we need to I'm going to start working on trying to figure out how to create legislation that we can start pushing. And it's going to fail at first. But, at first it was only California standing alone to legalize marijuana. This is a legitimate tool, and it can be used in other areas too. Obamacare. And again, I don't think that's something that necessarily going to happen in Oregon, but there's a number of states. Arizona passed a law last year basically refusing to provide any state cooperation with Obamacare. You can do it with federal gun laws. There's a lot of states. Idaho, I think, has a bill, passed a bill a couple of years ago that said that it will not cooperate with any future federal gun laws. They're not going to cooperate with enforcement. So this can be done. There are two basic things strategy-wise that you guys have to start doing. The first thing is you got to win hearts and minds. You know, there's a lot of people that don't understand. They don't understand the Constitution. They don't understand your issues. They don't understand why it matters. We've got to make them understand. And I think there's enough people now that are interested in doing this that we can help get your story out. We need to tell the story of the people that have suffered under inane policies. And I'm starting to see that. You know, I'm starting to see a lot of articles and stuff coming out where people had their cattle taken and their livelihoods taken. And we need to tell those stories. It needs to be humanized. Winning hearts and minds. And I think the hemp issue is a great way that you can build allies. You know, if they want hemp, well, you can't grow hemp on federal land, can you? People like steaks. From what I understand, you guys have cows. You know, people on the West Coast, they love this whole idea of free-range beef. We're going to have free-range beef. Well, you can't have free-range beef if you don't have any range, right? So you guys have some power. It's a matter of figuring out how to come together and to communicate those things. And hopefully, well, not hopefully, it's happening. Coalition of Western States and organizations like the 10th Amendment Center, we're going to start working to tell these stories. In the East, one of the big things, and it's an interesting parallel, it's raw milk. Federal government doesn't like raw milk either. And in fact, it's a crime to bring raw milk. I could get arrested for bringing raw milk across the border. And in fact, the FDA has said it would really like to ban raw milk completely, and it thinks it has the power to. And it's really cool because there's a lot of states right now that are starting to legalize raw milk sales within their state. Well, if all 50 states have raw milk sales, then we don't need to take it across the border so the FDA can go jump in that deep pond. So there's a lot of issues that we can bring together. Winning hearts and minds is important. And I think you guys can do it. You're wonderful people. And you know, you're normal everyday people. I think the world can relate to what's going on. So that's the first key. Winning hearts and minds in your legislature. First off, if you've got bad legislators in your districts, you need to coalesce together and get rid of them. And make it clear to them that if they're not going to represent you properly, they're not going to represent you at all. Bye-bye. Power of the ballot box. Second thing is you've got all of these other legislators out there that you don't have control over. Well, there's some things that you can start doing. First off, you can start asking nicely. Once we get some legislation developed and remind them that, you know, they swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. And I don't know about you guys, but I think when you swear an oath, that's pretty significant, right? It means something.
If they read it.
Well, yeah, exactly. It should mean something, and we need to remind them that it does. And you know, you start out and you play nice, and you educate. And then if they get belligerent, then you ridicule them. And that's a Solowinski tactic, you know. And we've done it. We've done it to some of these legal scholars. I mean, we make fun of them. Nobody likes to be made fun of, and there's nothing they can do about it. And it teaches everybody else around them that, oh, I don't want to be made fun of. I mean, maybe I better start looking into this stuff. They need to know that they need to uphold their oath. And the people that they represent need that too. And if they're going to uphold their oath and, you know, be willing to allow people to smoke weed and get high, then they ought to be able to let people raise cattle. That's what I think. There's things that you guys can do. We have social media. We have the Facebook. You know, I put a video out there, and I didn't really have all that big a reach. I put a video out the other day. It was just a little simple thing. It was actually a video of my dogmatic thing about the mortgage. And I posted it on Facebook, and like 4,000 people saw that video. You know, all of you can't make a video. You might not be aware, but you can post stuff. You can share things. That stuff is significant. It's a beautiful thing that we have in the internet now because we can bypass the official mouthpieces. You know, we don't have to depend on Rachel Maddow to give us our news. We can use social media. Some of you probably have some writing skill. You can write op-eds in your paper, in your state papers, and begin to tell your stories. You can do rallies, educate people, put together petitions. There's all kinds of things you can do. And then we need to get the political action going at the state level. You can influence your state legislators. How many of you ever called Congress before? Anybody ever called? Okay, this was my experience calling Congress. Let me see if it was similar. I call Congress and I talk to an intern. And they say, oh yes, we're very interested in your opinion. Thank you, Mr. Maharrey. We'll note that. And then about 3 weeks later, you get a form letter thanking you for contacting it. And it has actually nothing to do with what you called about. Right? Oh, it drives me crazy. People in D.C. don't give it, even your own people that you elect, they do not care what you think. They care about what the lobby money thinks. They care about what the guy that comes into their office thinks. They don't care about what you think. But state legislators are a different animal. And I can tell you this from experience. State legislators don't like public pressure, and they don't usually get it. I talked to a state legislator in Kentucky a couple of years ago. He told me he's gone through entire legislative sessions where he didn't get one call from a constituent on a bill. Now, I said, well, what would happen if all of a sudden like 60 people called your office on a given? He said, oh, that would freak me out. You can freak out state legislators by calling them. I have literally seen it. In this specific example in Arizona, there was a bill that was being held up by a committee chair. Committee chairs have a lot of power. They can decide whether a bill gets a hearing or not. And he was holding this bill up. It was a very popular bill. It was likely to pass if it got out of his committee. He was holding it up. Didn't like it. We found out that this individual was the one holding it up. And we put out an action alert through our channels at the 10th Amendment Center. And he got like 40 or 50 phone calls from people saying, look, you need to make sure that this bill gets a hearing. And you know what? 2 weeks later, he scheduled a hearing. That wouldn't happen at the federal level, because like I said, they don't care what you think. But the state legislature is a different animal. You have much more influence at the state level. You can spend 10 or 15 minutes making phone calls on a bill and actually know that you're probably having some type of impact. You're not going to always win, obviously. There's lobbyists and stuff at the state level. But if that won't work, then start at the local level. And if your local level people won't cooperate with them, then let them know if they're not going to represent you, they're not going to represent you. But I think one of a powerful thing that you can do is get your county commissioners to pass a resolution. Now, it didn't have any weight of law, but it tells the people at the state level, hey, these people in this county are serious about this, and they don't like political pressure. So, winning hearts and minds, political action at the state level. We've got some tools at the 10th Amendment Center that you can use. If you go to our website, I have business cards on my desk that have our website address. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com. You spell 10th out. But we actually have bill tracking pages where you can go to the specific issues that we're working on. You can click, there's a map, and it will have all the states, and you can click on your state and see what's going on. If there's a bill that's been introduced that has to do with that issue, it'll tell you what committee it's in and who to call. Beautiful. From what I understand, the Center for Self-Governance, which is another great organization that teaches people how to be activists at the state and local level. From what I understand, they're going to be having some training right here in Burns on March 12th. And their website is centerforgovernance.com. You spell it all out. These are tools that you guys need, because here's the thing. We can sit here and we can talk about it and we can be angry, but unless we're willing to do something about it, nothing's going to get done. I mean, nobody else is going to do it because nobody else cares. But a few people stepping up and beginning to take action can create a firestorm, and can create a tidal wave of action. I heard this somewhere, and I can't verify it, but I was told that basically the tipping point in public opinion is at about 15%. So if you can get 15% of a given population to buy into a given idea, they said the rest of the majority will end up following. 15%, that's not that many people. In fact, if you look at the American Revolution, the people that were really agitating for the American Revolution and for independence was a relatively small handful of people initially. And, you know, they did the whole community organizing thing, and good old Sam Adams, and they changed the course of history. So, I don't know, I hit a lot of things, and, you know, there's really no way I can get into every specific, but hopefully I gave you some good tools that you can utilize to move forward. And it's really exciting to me that you've had Chrisanne here, you've had Sheriff Mack, you're getting the teaching, we've got organizations that are coalescing together. We're going to stay in contact, and we're going to begin working to figure out how we can begin to have your needs addressed at the state and local level, because that's what needs to happen. What I want to do is I want to close out with a story. And I actually have a whole speech on this story, but I'm not going to do the whole speech. But it's one of my favorite historical events, and it's an historical event that not a lot of people have ever heard. It's one of those things that's fallen down the Orwellian memory hole. And it's the story of a man named Joshua. Now, at the beginning of the story, we don't know Joshua's last name because Joshua was a slave. He was a slave in Missouri, and he was owned by a man named Benjamin Stone Garland. And for whatever reason, at some point, Joshua decided that slavery wasn't for him. And he decided that he was going to run away and seek his own freedom. Now, from our perspective, it's easy to say, you know, well, of course, I run away. I'm not going to be a slave. But it wasn't that simple for them because, you know, that's the life that they knew. He was born into slavery. And, you know, he got fed and he got clothed, and he knew that if he tried to escape, he was apt to be, at best, sold south and put in a worse situation or at worst, killed. So it wasn't an easy decision. But he decided to make that trek. And so what he did is there was a barge. He lived on the Mississippi River, and there was a barge that was parked there, and every so often, black people would hide on that barge and would slip across to the northern side over to Illinois, and they'd get off and set foot on free soil. Joshua did that, and he walked all the way to a city called Racine, Wisconsin. Yeah, Racine, Wisconsin. All the way up to the Great Lakes. It's like 300 miles this guy walked with nothing but the clothes on his back. He said that he got some potatoes from a friendly farmer on his way, and that's all he had. I can't imagine walking 300 miles. That's what freedom was worth to Joshua. He settled down in Racine, and he got a job at a sawmill. And it's always interesting to me to kind of think back and wonder what it was like the first time he got a paycheck. You know? I mean, it had to be profound to have somebody say, you know, your labor is worth something. Here. And he had his own little home. It wasn't much. It was a one-room, dirt floor little shack, but it was his own. But things didn't go smoothly for very long for Joshua because Benjamin Stone Garland was a man known to get what was his. And he was able to track down Joshua. He went up into Wisconsin and he found him in Racine and actually enlisted the help of another escaped slave, which blows my mind why an escaped slave would help somebody, you know, capture somebody who was supposed to be a friend, but that's what happened. And Benjamin and several federal marshals banged on Joshua's door one night, and they drug him out, beat him over the head, threw him in a wagon, and drug him off to the town of Milwaukee. They took him to Milwaukee because Racine was a very abolitionist town, and they knew that probably keeping them there wasn't a very good idea. So they went to Milwaukee. The idea was they were going to hold him in the county jail overnight. They would get the judge to write a writ in the morning, and they would take him back south. Well, a newspaper editor in Racine found out that Joshua had been kidnapped, as he put it, and he telegraphed Sherman Booth, who was newspaper editor in Milwaukee. Sherman Booth was a staunch abolitionist. And so Sherman Booth put out some flyers and started running around town saying, hey, they've got a fugitive slave over here in our courthouse. And believe it or not, by that afternoon, there was between 2,000 and 3,000 people that had gathered in front of that courthouse in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If you read the AP report, it would have said a few people gathered. 2,000 to 3,000 people. But the interesting thing is if you read the accounts, it wasn't an unruly mob. They actually elected delegates. They broke up into wards of the city. It was actually more of a spontaneous, all of the community political meeting. And they voted on resolutions. And they took the resolutions to the judge, and they demanded that Joshua be released on a writ of habeas corpus and force Benjamin Stone Garland to prove his ownership. And the judge refused. And so there was a bunch of speeches, and the crowd started getting wound up, and it became clear that the judge was not going to release Joshua. And so at some point somebody said, does anybody have a key? And one guy picked up a large piece of wood that was at a nearby construction site, and he said, this will make a good enough key. And they battered down the door, and they took Joshua out of the jail, and they put him on a wagon, and they drove him quickly out of town. They said it was like the 4th of July, like he was doing the, you know, and people were cheering. But they were able to get him out of town, and they were able to get him on the Underground Railroad. And he spent the next 3 weeks going from house to house through, it's interesting, he traveled like 80 miles, in actually real miles, it was only 12. He ended up back in Racine. They got him on a barge and took him across the Great Lakes into Canada. And he spent the rest of his life a free man in Canada. And it's interesting because you can actually go and you can look at his, they've got records in Canada, like where he sold crops and his marriage license and all those things. Lived his life out as a free man. Not good. Here's the thing that intrigues me about this story. I mean, it's great. You know, it's a beautiful story of a man seeking out his freedom. But the thing that really grips me is the fact that Joshua would have never been free if there hadn't been people that were willing to stick their necks out on his behalf. Now, the sad thing is that old Sherman Booth, he ended up getting hauled into court by the federal government, charged with violating the fugitive slave law. And ultimately, ended up spending time in jail for his efforts. Ended up losing his press, ended up losing his livelihood. But all of those people took that risk. Everybody who ever hid an escaped slave on the Underground Railroad risked federal arrest. And yet they did it anyway. Because they believed that this man's freedom was worth that risk. They believed that liberty and freedom was worth the risk. And I've come to believe that as well. You know, I'm pretty much a pacifist. Like, I'm not into armed conflict and that type of thing. But I do believe that you should stand up for what's right and do what's right. And those people believed that it was right for Joshua to have his freedom, and they stood up and they took that risk, and some of them paid the consequences. But ultimately, he lived a free man, and ultimately that system was changed. It takes committed individuals to advance and protect liberty. Whether it's somebody like me that's working for an organization, or somebody just like you guys who are learning and can share it with other people, or making a phone call to a state legislator, or, you know, being willing to say, you know what, we're not going to cooperate with this. You know, I'm all for mass civil disobedience if it's played right and in a situation where you can win. I mean, look at how the civil rights movement used that tool. So in closing, I'm going to share my favorite quote with you. It's Frederick Douglass, another person that knew something about being in servitude, a former slave. And he said this, he said, "Find out just what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." I don't know about you guys, my endurance ran out a long time ago. You know, I don't face the same issues that you guys do, but I want to live free. That's all I want. I want my kids to live free. You know, I've got teenagers. I want them to live in America as it was conceived. And I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to come to Burns, Oregon, you know, and probably had the feds follow me around somewhere.
After the meeting.
Yeah, you know, I mean, honestly, this is considered subversive to some people, just teaching. Well, you know what? The heck with them, because I'm not going to shut up.